Hey, thanks for joining me today. I've got a story to tell. I am out at the Hill Air Force Base Museum in Roy, Utah, and the story is kind of a religious story, kind of a love story, kind of an action story, kind of World War II story about one of my heroes, and last but not least, kind of a genealogy story. Kind of excited to tell this story. It's well, you'll see what I feel about it. I just hope I don't bomb it. Minuteman missiles behind me. Anyway, stick around. I think you'll like it. So right now I'm in the section where they're honoring the women of the Air Force, and many of them were also killed in World War II. But I thought this would be a great place to get this kicked off, and so. Just to start with, there were many things there were sequences of many events that happened for me to find this, but I'm not going to go into a lot of them. But one thing that did happen was way back, even before they had computers, my mom and her friend were doing a lot of genealogy together, helping each other. And my mom's friend had this dream that there was somebody missing in our family tree that was born in Ireland or Irish descent. And so when my mom had passed away, I was going through all of her things, and I saw this printout that she had kept of this dream, and I didn't know whether or not she had found this person, if there even was a person. And so that's how I got started. I started looking in my Irish ancestors for somebody missing, and then I'll continue on to tell you what I found. This bad boy is a B-17 bomber, and here is the P-51 Mustang. These Mustangs were the ones that went up to protect the squadrons of the bombers, of the B-17 bombers. Oddly enough, this one has the name Audrey on it, which is my grandmother's name, and the story I'm about to tell is going to be about my grandmother's cousin's boy named Fred Delborn. And what had happened is I'm going through the family tree just looking for somebody missing in the Ireland line, and I come across this young man, Fred Delborn, and it shows that he dies at age 24. And I just become fascinated with him, trying to find out his story. And it was pretty amazing the things that I found out about him, and that's what I'm going to be telling now, is his story and how it ties into the dream of somebody missing. Fred was obviously strong because he grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, where winters were nasty as anywhere on the planet. He attended high school in Duluth and excelled in sports. He was on the basketball, softball, track team, but his favorite sport was football. In fact, after high school, he got a scholarship to the University of Minnesota to play football for them. And at the time, they were the #1 team in the nation. Now, Fred had his eye on a real cute girl that went to school with him. Her name was Geraldine Hansen, but she went by Jerry. Jerry was a year behind Fred in school, but they lived only a few blocks apart from each other, which made it convenient for their relationship to bloom. Fred held down the job while going to college. At least on his draft card, it showed that he was working, at the same time he was going to school. In addition to being in love with Jerry, his girl back home, he had a love for flying and became an amateur pilot during his first year of college in 1940. Fred would often fly over Jerry, and she said that he would wiggle his wings at me. Fred and Jerry were married May 2nd, 1942, about 5 months after the U.S. entered World War II. And then just 3 weeks after their marriage, on May 30th, 1942, Fred enlisted in the Air Force against his new bride's wishes, who had hoped he would just wait until he was drafted like everyone else. The newlyweds had a wonderful few months together, and then in the winter of 1942, Fred entered basic training, as did everyone else who would eventually be joining his crew. Fred completed his intensive training as a pilot of a B-17 bomber, and in the summer of 1943, The crew of 10 men were introduced to each other, and together they trained at 3 different bases for the next 4 months. So their final training was in Spokane, Washington, where Jerry was allowed to live with Fred. She met all the crew members and had wonderful things to say about them and their camaraderie, because they would all spend time together after the training was over each day. In November of 1943, the time came for everyone to say goodbye to their loved ones. Fred's last words to Jerry were "Auf Wiedersehen," which means goodbye till we meet again. He turned and slowly walked away. She never imagined she would never see him again. Jerry returned home to Duluth and wrote to Fred every day. Let me insert something here. About this time in November of 1943, a B-17 bomber miraculously returned home from its 21st bombing mission over Germany. Now, over the course of the war, over 4,700 of these planes didn't return. In this plane, though, were 2 dead crew members. One of its 4 engines was shot out. It had several holes over 2 feet wide in it, and the tail was in shreds. It would be in the shop for about a month, getting repaired and waiting for a new crew to take it on its 22nd and final bombing mission. On December 16, 1943, that new rookie crew would be piloted by Fred Delborn, assigned to the newly rebuilt B-17 bomber that very morning. They received their orders early in the morning, and then they prepared and departed for Bremen, Germany. Now for the part that I'm really excited about and amazed, these guys are totally my heroes. So one of the crew members said, ahead of us was a huge black cloud, such as I've never seen before or since. It was coal black, much darker than any thunder clouds. It seemed as if there were no limit to the height or the length of it. And this was all coming from anti-aircraft. They were just launching it up like crazy, and it was just exploding all around them. Now, as the bombing run began, their plane began lurching up and down from the flak exploding all around them. A bolt of flak actually hit the right wing, which left a hole large enough to throw a kitchen sink through. Apparently, it just went right through the wing. Just after that, enemy fire hit their plane from the German planes that were up there circling around outside of the flak. And a few moments later, there was a violent explosion under the aircraft, and that sent their aircraft into a dive of 1,000 feet. The pilots were able to gain control of the plane. The crew members were like pinned down to the floor from the centrifugal force of the dive. But the pilots got control of the plane. The pilot, Delborn, was actually wounded in the arm then, and so he was relying on the co-pilot for assistance. However, the bomb bay doors were buckled and on fire, and the number 3 engine was burning and throwing oil. The pilots could see the formation of the planes that they were in just a moment ago up ahead of them and 5,000 feet higher in the air. They began dropping their bombs on the target. Our crew quickly extinguished the fire and had to manually open the bomb bay doors, and they did that just in time to release their bombs on the target too. However, the plane and the crew were in serious trouble. With an engine out and the bomb bay door jammed open, holes in the wing, they quickly fell behind, and as they turned to head back to England, they were just falling farther and farther behind. Almost immediately, their B-17, just flying by itself, it was attacked by a dozen enemy aircraft. The wounded rookie crew now began the fight of their lives. The German planes attacked from all directions, 2 coming straight at them. They were able to shoot down one of them, but the second one kept shooting, and it hit their number 2 engine, and it also hit the top turret. And the crew member that was manning the gun in the turret, he was hit in the face by the explosion from the plexiglass, and it actually forced him to go, or sent him flying. The plane that was coming at them kept firing away, and our guys were firing at it, and eventually we hit the German plane, and it exploded right in front of them. with pieces of it hitting their plane as they flew through the explosion. Another plane hit them on the side, and it wounded one of the side gunners in the arm and the leg, and it kind of knocked him unconscious. The other gunner had his machine gun hit, and there were like two guns that they were shooting with, and one of them it damaged. He was still shooting with the other one, but when it was hit, his hand was wounded, and his thumb was paralyzed, and so with one hand he was still fighting with the one machine gun. Now, up in the cockpit, Captain Delburn was watching the formation flying back to England, ahead of him, and their plane was falling farther and farther behind and losing altitude quickly. He realized that they weren't going to make it back, and he gave the order to bail out. However, with the intercom system down and the firing of the machine guns in the back of the plane, the only ones who heard were the co-pilot and the 3 men up front manning their stations. Unbeknownst to the 5 in the back, 3 of their crew members bailed out. And just as a note, that they were immediately captured. And well, actually, they were all captured, the ones who were able to bail out, but they were captured right away. And they became 3 POWs, the same with all the other ones who survived. Now, one of the men who bailed out was best friends with the co-pilot and asked if he was going to be bailing out too, but Captain Delborn, with only one good arm, said he needed him, and so he stayed behind so that we still had the 2 pilots in the cockpit flying the plane. Now, the German fighters by now had circled around, and they came back to just take down this B-17. Again, the B-17 was hit by fire. This time it killed the co-pilot, and it just riddled the plane with bullets, which sounded like a hailstorm, inside. Everyone in the plane was wounded except for the tail gunner at this point, and that's including the 3 who bailed out, initially. And as the plane was slowly going down and losing altitude, in a trail of smoke, the fighters had seemed to disappear at this point. The German fighters were gone. And it turns out that our P-51 Mustangs turned up to give protection to the main formation, and that caused all the Germans to leave the fight. And so at this point, our plane was going down. The captain, Delborn, put the plane, I guess, on autopilot and crawled back to the back and hollered at everyone he went back to the back expecting to see everyone gone, and they were still there. And so he gave the order for them to bail out, which they did. And so what had happened, they revived the airman who was on the floor in a pool of his blood, and they helped him get a parachute on, and they got the parachute on. They had to put it on upside down because his arm was wounded, and he couldn't pull the pull string with the drawstring with his wounded arm, so they had to put it on upside down so he could use his good arm to pull the parachute. And so as soon as they got it on, he just runs and jumps out of the plane, and he landed on they were all luckily to land on an island except for him. He landed just on the shore off of the island in the probably up to his waist in water. And the other ones, they in the plane immediately jumped out too. They were able to land on the island on land. Now the one on the sand wounded so bad he couldn't get his parachute off, and he was calling for help. And actually someone on the island came out to help him, but before they could reach him, a gust of wind picked up and it caught his parachute, and it just took him away. It blew him out to sea. And so he was lost and killed. And it was his brother, actually, who wrote this amazing book called Gone with the Wind, he said. And that was written by Dartner. Highly recommend it. Excellent book. And so the other ones were all immediately captured too. Now back to the airplane, the pilot, not sure really if everyone had got out, probably trying to give him as much time as possible, decided, his best chance at this point now was going to be to ditch the plane, which is to land it in water. And so he's flying over the island just really close to the roofs of this small village. People heard him coming, and the Germans that were there, the soldiers, got their rifles out and started shooting at the plane as it was flying overhead. But the plane just barely clears the land, the beach, and it hits into the water just right off the shore. Unfortunately, the wing was tilted just a little bit, and the wing caught in a wave, and it flipped the plane and rolled it over. And the witnesses said that there were no survivors that came up. The next morning, the Germans sent out a diving team, and they came back and said there were two dead men, in the cockpit. Later on, throughout the years, storms had come in and washed the plane. Just moved it all out to sea, and so it's lost. There's no more plane anymore. But the Germans interrogated the prisoners that were able to make it, the 7 of them. And part of the interrogation, they said that there were 2 dead pilots, and so they knew that Fred Delborn and the other one. His last name was Neff, but the co-pilot, they were both killed. So Neff, Dartner, and Delborn were killed, and they were killed in action. That is such an amazing story. My heart just goes out with thanks to everybody who has served our country in the military and paid the ultimate price. Wow. Let's talk about Jerry now for just a minute, because she has a pretty interesting story too. There was a news article that was done. She was interviewed by the Duluth News Tribune when she was close to being 100. She lived to be 100, but I think at age 98, they interviewed her, and she gave a really good interview. And I'm going to just read some paragraphs from that. Will explain a lot about her and her experiences, because it was pretty amazing too. And so just to start off, recalling the love of a lifetime ago. And she's mentioned as Marshall, Geraldine Marshall, and Jerry in this article. She had remarried, and her name was Marshall. And so I'm just going to call her Jerry. So Jerry spoke of the sky-high feelings she would get from a young West Duluth pilot she married, then lost in a trail of smoke within the whirlwind of World War II. He used to wiggle his wings at me, she said of Fred Delborn Jr., who had been a Danfield High School football star and amateur pilot before voluntarily enlisting in the Army Air Corps. I wouldn't go up in the plane with him. I was afraid of it, so I didn't put myself in that position. And then later on she says, "It was a good life," Jerry said, "except for all the sadness." She said, "I'm Duluth's oldest minimalist." She said of the propensity to shed her possessions for charity. Her nephew was there with her during the interview, and he was quoted a few times. He said he took through a list of things that Jerry had shared or done without, starting with a wooden dining room table that she donated to a family victimized by a fire. She sold all of her jewelry, except for one single treasure her mother left her, and she gifted the proceeds to a Catholic schools. She was a breast cancer survivor. Jerry never had children, but she said she always wanted 4. She mostly did without her father, a woodsman who was hardly around until he drifted away for good. The kids had to be put into an orphanage once during a particularly tough time for the family was having during the Great Depression. She said, "We never had much, and we were used to it. That's the way you lived." For her hardest sacrifice of all, Jerry split a military life insurance option following her husband's death with his mother. He would have liked that, she said, putting a tissue to work. Oh, that makes tears come. Delborn was designated missing in action after the final flight of the B-17, known as the Lonesome Polecat II, in December 1943. A decade went by without him before Jerry followed the advice of her priest and moved on, spending the next 60 years married and in love with another West Duluth son, Joseph Marshall, now also deceased. Until recently, Jerry went her whole life declining to register for military benefits owed to her. She was believing that others needed the modest sums more than she did. She never stopped caring for Delborn and always kept his framed portrait close by. "I really love that man. I'll never forget him," she said. "He was in my prayers every night." Fred and Jerry pinballed across the country with his training shortly after they were married in 1942. She got to know his fellow lieutenants, their wives, and the other crew members as special people. Many years later, she made a series of trips to reunite with them, boarding Greyhound buses, sometimes with her mother as travel partner, bound for far-flung locations of the 7 survivors and their families. Her nephew explained the reason behind the closeness of the tight-knit group. The whole crew was together because the B-17 crews were billeted together, said Hansen, a former high school teacher and amateur historian of his uncle's fateful flight. The B-17 crews that started together finished together. Deeply in love, the couple said goodbye at a hotel in Spokane, Washington in October of 1943, but not before he bought her a polka-dotted dress, which elicited a timeless studio portrait of the couple looking their happiest. They went from Spokane to Nebraska to be outfitted in cold weather gear, and then they flew off to Greenland and over to England. Hansen said of the 10-member crew, that was the last she saw of them. Jerry returned home to Duluth and found work. Swept up by an economy that turned to women to fill even its most rigorous jobs, she landed a job at the Duluth Paper Box Company, which she recalled was Van Vicks for the owner's last name. And it says it was located near an area now occupied by Versco Paper Mills in West Duluth. She walked to work, of course, and spent double-digit years at the box company, making boxes that held everything from locally made diamonds to fancy chocolates. She said, "I ran all the machines. I was a whiz at the pedals. Mine was the machine that would deliver little staples to hold the corners together. They were small boxes. Sometime after what was a heroic last flight on December 16, 1943, Delborn's letters stopped arriving home to Marshall. The love letters she'd sent in response were later delivered back to her. And I read in another source that she wrote him every day. And she has preserved all correspondences pertaining to Delborn chronologically in boxes. Delborn's Purple Heart also arrived in mail, protected in velvet and meticulously packaged. It went unopened for decades until Jerry took it from a drawer and delivered it for display at the Richard Bong Veterans Historic Center in Superior in 2013. Jerry also saved the 2-sentence telegram that came to her door in January 1944, informing her that her husband was missing in action. And I read in another source that just right before that, she had sat down to listen to some music. She put the record on and sat down, and then she said, Fred appeared to her. She said that he smiled at her, and he put his hand and reached out and touched her arm, and then he disappeared. And then it was just shortly after that there was a knock on the door from Western Union, in which she got the telegram saying that he was missing in action. And that ushered in one of the saddest periods in her life. There was crying, lots of crying, she said, but I was working all the time too, and you don't cry at work. Another of the perfectly preserved letters arrived for Jerry on November 11, 1945, written by one of the surviving airmen, a sergeant named Charles Schreiner. The typewritten letter exists as a stunning example of wartime correspondence. When the showdown came, We gave our best, it said. Our 10 men fought splendidly as a team. The late Schreiner, who died in 2000, was responding to a private letter from Jerry asking for a better picture of what happened to her husband. Across 7 pages, he detailed hell breaking loose in the sky 5 miles above Bremen, Germany. And then I had covered a lot of what was said in that letter. He pointed out, despite being struck by a bullet in his left arm, Delborn crawled through a narrow catwalk to the compact radio room and gave the command for everyone else to abandon the aircraft immediately. Schreiner was among the 7 parachuting survivors, some of whom were captured and imprisoned for 18 months by the Germans. And that's a whole new experience to talk about what those guys went through as prisoners there. But said the plane disappeared. He said the plane disappeared in front of a trail of smoke as it headed towards its fateful crash off Netherlands' Texel Island in the nearby North Sea. It did not explode, and all the time it was in my sight, wrote Schreiner, who went on to praise Delborn as a plane commander. He could not be beat, and as a pilot, he was aces. There was a source that said all the survivors loved Delborn and that he cared for them. He was always asking how they were doing and if there's anything he could get them or anything they needed. He really looked out for them and was a good friend. And so that's kind of the tragic. It says that's the tragic and heartwarming war story of a young wife left behind after the love of her life vanishes over Germany. Asked about the sacrifices made by her first husband and other men she knew, Jerry reflected on the cost. It must have been important, she said, or they wouldn't have taken so many healthy young men. And so that's a little bit about her experience. Just some amazing people. So kind of back to my story about looking for the missing person. As I was doing all this research, I was just fascinated with learning everything I could about my second cousin, and he became a hero of mine. But as I was digging through all this information and doing all this research, I had discovered that he had a sister, and the sister was not showing in FamilySearch, and so I was able to find a lot of documents about her and get her added into the family tree. And then I was also able to add Jerry into the family tree and attach them, and so now it shows the complete family. It shows Fred and his wife Jerry, and those two are missing, and so I guess that's the kind of the good thing about the way it all ended up, was we were able to get the whole family together. Kind of a fun little story. I was out at the Hill Air Force Base Museum September, I think it was on the 9th, and I'm taking some pictures of the B-17, making a little video about my cousin Fred Delborn, and just across the aisle is the B-29, and I'm recording, talking about the B-17, and then I hear a little voice, little old woman said, "Excuse me, sir, would you like to meet a World War II veteran?" And I'm like, "Oh, heck yeah." And I stopped what I was doing, and I just walked over here about 10 feet and met Norris Jernigan, who was on the crew. There were like 1,200 men on the crew that trained to drop the atomic bomb, and this is the B-29, which was the one that dropped the atomic bomb, but not this exact plane, but I stood here and met him, and it was an honor to talk to him, and I asked him questions for about 10 minutes, and then he mentioned that there was a lot of information about him online, and so I go online and I'm reading all this about him, and then and I'd like jump up off the bench, and then I'd run back and find him and talk to him for another 10 minutes. But it was pretty amazing to meet him. It was an honor, actually. Appreciate these men who fought for our country. It's beautiful up here in the mountains. Fall is just starting to happen. Officially, the first day of fall is tomorrow, September 23rd. But I wanted to come up in the mountains where the leaves are starting to change colors to just finish this up. I was just curious how old our crew would be if they were still alive today. There were some of them on if they were still living, there were some of them that would be 110, and the youngest one would be 101. So that's just to give you an idea of how old the veterans and those who served in the war in World War II are. So when it comes time for us to say goodbye to our loved ones, you know, maybe like Fred and his crew, like a big storm. Right now it's hailing right now, and there's a big old black cloud covering a beautiful mountain. You know, maybe that's what it's going to be like, or who knows, maybe it's going to be like a nice blue sky on the beach, nice warm weather. Who knows what it's going to be like for us, but it'll happen just like all the leaves turn colors and fall off. You know, the trees in the spring, they're replaced by new ones. It's kind of like a good example of what it's like to live on Earth. So this is just me, my imagination, but here's what I like to think about, that when those men all died and entered the spirit world, they all, you know, initially the three of them went together, and then through the years, all the others joined. They were really close to each other and fought together and had some bonds that I think are going to be pretty hard to break. But I imagine to myself, when they each enter the spirit world, the ones that have preceded them were there, and I want to think the ones, you know, who just passed were maybe greeted by their loved ones, their family, you know, who's already gone ahead of them. But then after that initial greeting, I like to think that they looked, you know, maybe off to the side, and there were all the other members of that crew, you know, the 10 men who were together. I imagine them all lined up in formation, you know, just saluting the person who just, you know, passed through the veil and entered the spirit world, and then they just all, you know, embrace. And you know, that's just kind of my imagination of how it works. So what a love story, an action story. I imagine that when Jerry passed away 60 or 70 years after Fred did, that there was a nice embrace, and that he was one of the first people waiting for Jerry when she crossed the veil, went on into the spirit world. And so their marriage, their relationship, it could go on forever. This life is just such a little blip in the grand scheme of things. All right, I'm going to finish up. I am on a mountain, and in latter days we refer temples to as mountain of the Lord, but it's mountain, temples, kind of synonymous. So this is where I'm going to finish up and just talk about a little bit about genealogy and temple work. I know there's a lot of reasons why we do genealogy. One is to find cool stories about our ancestors and learn about our DNA, if we're related to royalty or who knows what reasons, but it's fun. But another reason is to find our ancestors and do temple ordinances for them. It would take a long time to explain that, but just really quickly, there's special ordinances that need to be done, and you know, such as baptism, married for time and all eternity, and it takes someone with the right authority to do that. And we believe that we have that authority on the earth today. It's the priesthood, and It's a special thing. We do it by proxy, for these people that have lived and gone and haven't had that chance themselves. And so that is one reason why we do genealogy, and it is my testimony that families can be together forever. And it's such a cool thing. What a cool plan that Heavenly Father has for us to make it possible for us to return and live with Him, with our loved ones. And so that is all I had for you. I thank you for watching, and from the top of a mountain, I'll try to do my German ancestors justice and just say, Auf Wiedersehen. Thank you for watching. Bye now. Take care.